Okay, so welcome to part 3 of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Policy lecture. I hope you're as excited about policy as me. I absolutely get that you are going to be overwhelmed and also confused by the level of policies and the number of policies. We do not expect you to be able to actually detail specific policies at great length. What we need you to understand from this is a couple of things. If you can take away that there's a lot of policies, that the space is complex, and that health is complex, you are winning. Now, if you actually spend the time looking at one of the policies, even if you're just reading the executive summary or a couple of executive summaries, really starting to understand the differences across the policies. When you're looking at policies, consider the social determinants, whether or not it takes a social determinants approach, whether or not there's a cultural lens applied to it and a cultural determinants approach, and whether or not you can see in any of the processes that are determined, that are outlined around the consultation, whether or not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were actively engaged in the process. And they're really good things to consider when you're looking at policy. So we're going to look at closing the gap and close the gap. And yes, they're confusing. I still actually mix them up, even though I know exactly what the differences is. So don't be surprised if you do, but please try and make sure in your final assessment that you absolutely get them right. So close the gap and closing the gap. So we're going to focus on closing the gap first. So closing the gap was, the Closing the Gap Steering Committee was a committee that was established in 2006, which was under the guidance of Tom Calma, who was the then Social Justice Commissioner. He was actually advocating for a closing the gap in health between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and other Australians. So this was an organic campaign that was actually initially supported also by Oxfam. And what we saw was a whole bunch of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal organisations come together to advocate for an increased focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. They had a number of demands, which you can actually have a look at in the evaluation of closing the gap. But essentially, it was a couple of things: making sure that there was health equality, but also that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were actively engaged in the process. The first time I actually saw Close the Gap was a big banner outside of the channel. I can't remember what Sunrise is on now. So, well, anyway, outside Sunrise, they used to have big glass where people could stand out and watch the show in the morning. Someone had a big banner around Close the Gap. So look, Close the Gap has shifted a little bit over time. So I'm going to focus on what it looks like now rather than take you through all of the iterations. So the Closing the Gap Steering Committee aims to close the gap of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health gap. They want to do this by implementing a human rights approach to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. So remember the human rights that we talked about in week 3 from memory, where we looked at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also looking at all of the other mechanisms as well. The next slide is not quite right, so we're going to skip that one and go to this one. Oh, that's not what we want, my apologies. So the co-chairs of Closing the Gap currently are June Oscar, who is the first female Commissioner of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Social Justice Commissioner, and Carl Briscoe, who is the CEO of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Workers Association, otherwise known as NATSIWA. So we've also had co-chairs that were from National Congress of Australia's First People, co-chairs from NATCHO. So Tom Calma was the first co-chair, and there's always been a co-chair that's been the Social Justice Commissioner. We've also had Mick Gooder as well, who was the Social Justice Commissioner after we had Tom Calma. So, as I said, the Close the Gap Steering Committee is made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and people. I've sat on this committee in a number of capacities. So I'm a member, I'm on the board of the Public Health Association of Australia as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander VP. I am one of the reps from the organisation that attends these meetings. But I've also been involved when I was at the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, and also when I was at the National Congress of Australia's First People. So I have sat in on a number of these meetings in a variety of capacities. What you can see is that it's got some really significant players. So you've got the Australian Medical Association, you've also got the Healing Foundation, which is the foundation we've shown you videos about this from the Stolen Generation. It has the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation. So this is a really influential group. Mick Gooder said there's no quick fix when it comes to improving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. We need rock solid commitment with structures in place that will survive terms of government. So essentially the call of this steering committee has been that this goes well beyond that of election cycles. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health is not going to be fixed in an election cycle, and we need bipartisan support. Now, I want to show you a quick video of this. Hopefully this works. So this is an evaluation of the Close the Gap campaign from 2006 to 2011. I won't show you all of it.
2005 Social Justice Report, the then Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, Dr. Tom Calma, drew the nation's attention to the inequality of the health status between Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous Australians. Dr. Calma documented the appalling 17-year life expectancy gap, an infant mortality rate 3 times higher than non-Indigenous Australians, and heart disease rates between 2 and 3 times the rest of Australia. Dr. Calma called on the governments of Australia to commit to achieving equality of health status and life expectation between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous people within 25 years.
The campaign really did come about following on from a report, the Social Justice Report of 2005, where I looked at and devoted a chapter to look at the inequality of outcomes, health outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And when that went to the Parliament in March 2006, I also invited Indigenous and the non-Indigenous members of the health sector, the peak bodies, to come in and talk about what was in the Social Justice Report and try and share my vision. Fortunately, they thought it was a good idea, and so that was really the beginning in the 10th of March in 2006 that the Close the Gap Steering Committee was formed.
Major health and human rights organisations were pulled together as a coalition of partners led by the Australian Human Rights Commission. These partners worked together through a campaign steering committee to shape a clear direction, shared vision and common approach. A carefully considered and phased strategic approach brought together 3 critical campaign elements to effect change: convincing decision makers of the need for change and building infrastructure for change. This approach harnessed the strength of a political engagement strategy supported by mass public mobilisation. The Close the Gap Steering Committee combined people and organisations with skills in a range of areas. Time-bound and measurable campaign goals were set, activities were agreed upon, along with agreement for what each partner would contribute to the campaign. Paramount to the logic of the campaign was the placement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health squarely within a human rights framework. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the right to health. Holding government to account for the upholding of this right was at the core of the campaign. The development of a rights-based blueprint for closing the gap and targets to realise health equality provided a roadmap for action and the framework within which to hold government to account. The establishment of the Close the Gap campaign steering committee under Indigenous leadership has been highlighted as a unique and critical feature of the campaign. The strength of independent leadership by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner ensured cohesion and respect for the coalition as a formidable alliance. The campaign was able to maximise timing of the electoral cycle to gain political traction and developed with a multi-party approach. Individuals and organisations had a passionate commitment to the campaign and were prepared to dedicate time and expertise. This involvement was described by a steering committee member as spirit and intellect. The effective and consistent message of Close the Gap deployed a positive "we can do it" focus, while still maintaining a realistic timeframe for achieving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health equality.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. So you can see why I showed you that, because that was so well put together that I can't do it justice to explain it by comparison to that. And you do not need to see my emails. So that is the summary of the campaign as told through the evaluation. You can see that it had a significant influence on policy. What we actually saw was that there was then they were talking about policy and politics. So what we ended up seeing was that in 2008, the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and the opposition leader made a statement that they were going to support the principles under the Closing the Gap campaign, and they signed the Statement of Intent. So the Statement of Intent was a document, which I'm going to show you in the next part, which actually outlined the commitment to improving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and achieving health equality. And I will fix that slide in your actual slides. So let's now focus on closing the gap, because that's essentially what it became when Kevin Rudd signed that Statement of Intent. Government policy became closing the gap. Now the steering committee, the Close the Gap steering committee still exists, and it is separate to closing the gap. So closing the gap's government, Close the Gap is independent. It's a pain in the ass that Kevin Rudd actually just adopted the name and added an ing on the end of close, but it is what it is. So the short summary, here is a snapshot that I actually included in my PhD, a little flow chart. So we had the 2008 signing of the Statement of Intent. Then what we had was, from that intent, you actually saw a National Indigenous Reform Agreement. So this agreement was put together by COAG, the Coalition of Australian, the Council of Australian Governments, which is now going to become the National Council. And it outlined a number of priorities in there, as well as multiple mechanisms for implementation, and also looking at who was responsible for the variety of implementation. So then you've got the Closing the Gap framework, which sits underneath the NIRA, which goes from 2009 to 2031. You also have from 2012 ongoing to measure the framework. You have the National Key Performance Indicators, which was what my PhD was looking at. And then you also have another number of other national partnership agreements which sit underneath the National Indigenous Reform Agreement. So you have remote Indigenous service delivery, Indigenous economic participation, Indigenous early childhood development, Indigenous health, remote Indigenous housing, remote Indigenous public internet access. Now, most of those national partnership agreements expired in 2018 and most of them have not been updated. So that's kind of a snapshot of closing the gap and the multiple mechanisms. So let's look at the statement of intent. You can see the signatures on the left, Brendan Nelson, Kevin Rudd, and this was ratified by COAG, which is really important because essentially that means that states and territories have actually signed up to this as well as the Commonwealth Government. Now, if you remember when I talked about the National Aboriginal Health Strategy, one of the key failings was actually a lack of collaboration between the states and territories with the Commonwealth. So this is a particularly important point to make. So what were the targets? So there were a number of targets. Close the gap in life expectancy within a generation, halve the gap in mortality rates for Indigenous children under 5 by 2018, ensure access to early childhood education for all Indigenous 4-year-olds in remote communities by 2013, halve the gap in reading, writing and numeracy achievement for children by 2018, halve the gap in Indigenous students in Year 12 or equivalent attainment rates by 2020, and equivalent is Year 12 through the TAFE system. Halve the gap in employment outcomes between Indigenous and other Australians by 2018. So of the social determinants here, we obviously see there's a focus on health, but there is also education and also employment. And again, we're looking at a number of things. We're looking at access as well as attainment. So we're looking at process. So a process is something that you do to increase, to drive outcomes. So a process is making sure that there is access to childhood education services, and then halve the gap is an outcome. So where are we at? So this is 2012. What we actually see is that essentially, if you look at the far right, you look at the Australian column here, only 2 targets are on track. And what this means is that we haven't been able to achieve the statistics that, sorry, the targets as they stand. This has been an immense disappointment, as you can imagine, because what it means is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are still having worse health outcomes and other outcomes than other Australians. Now, I do want to make a point that that doesn't mean things haven't gotten better for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but we actually know that health has gotten better for all Australians, and so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples still experience a gap despite the fact that their health has improved, but also there has been higher levels of education and employment. So what we can see is that early child education by 2025 is on track, and also Year 12 or equivalent is on track. And you can see that different states and territories are at different points. So essentially now what's happening is called Closing the Gap Refresh. So they did a review of Closing the Gap. And this is coming from the Closing the Gap Steering Committee. And they identified a number of issues relating to health services, health infrastructure, and social determinants. So there's been an issue with the fact that the social determinants have been focused on specifically employment and education. Now, one of the things that you should be taking away from this subject is that the social determinants are interrelated. So if you don't actually have a job, it's hard then to get your children into school and give them opportunities. But likewise, if you actually don't have a job, you can't put enough food on the table, your children aren't going to necessarily have enough to eat, and their concentration might also be impacted. And thinking outside of health and education, if you're thinking about housing, if you've got overcrowded houses, it's hard for children to study or sleep. If you've got an overcrowded house, it means that you're more likely to have communicable diseases. Or if you've got housing insecurity, so if you're homeless or at risk of homelessness, then you're not necessarily going to be able to go to school if you're a young person, or go to uni if you're slightly older, or even get a job. So we need to realise the impact that the social determinants have on each other. And with having such a narrow focus in the closing the gap, it has limited the ability to close that health gap. There was also an issue with the fact that there has been a lack of understanding of the cultural determinants. So cultural determinants being the way we actually know, be and do, and how that impacts the way we actually perceive health, and also making sure that the education system set it up for us, and also making sure that the workforce understands our needs. So we really need to think about, when we're thinking about closing the gap, analysing it from a holistic point of view rather than just focusing on the two social determinants that are in there. Racism came up a lot, so access to services that are free of racism has been an issue, and culturally appropriate services as well. So it's not just about a health service that's free of racism, it's also about a culturally appropriate service. So when we're thinking about access, we're thinking about access from a geographical point of view, but a cultural point of view as well. That's a really important thing to remember. So one of the other issues that has been a problem has been the lack of partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If you remember what I said about the National Aboriginal Health Strategy from 1989, which was evaluated in 1994, one of the key components that, well, one of the key failures of that was the lack of engagement and partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So this is actually something that has been repeated over time through multiple policies. There has been ongoing lack of partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and what we've seen is that policies tend to fail. We've also seen there's been a lack of accountability. So there has not been government accountability to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So yes, the government has to report every 12 months on the progress of closing the gap, but it hasn't actually then had any, hasn't had to do anything differently based on those findings. There is no one to hold the government to account. So what this has led to is a closing the gap refresh. What the refresh initially started out as a Commonwealth initiative, and it consulted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but by and large, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations were really dissatisfied with the consultation process. I participated in one of them. Essentially what happened is that state and territory and Commonwealth government presented what it thought should be the approach, and it was not the approach that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people thought was appropriate. And so there was a bit of this stalemate, but what we actually saw was a partnership agreement between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their peak bodies, as well as the Coalition of Australian Governments. And this was formalised in March 2019 with the signing of a partnership agreement. And the partnership agreement was with the National Coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations, which is a new body that's been established outside of, say, Close the Gap, because it's just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, the Local Government Association, but also COAG. So local government doesn't sit at COAG. So for those that may not be aware, local governments aren't actually in the Constitution. So they're not part of the COAG process. But what this actually partnership does is make a commitment to genuine partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And what the partnership aims to do, and the partnership is ongoing, so March 2019 was when it started. There've been a number of meetings about this, there's been a number of progress, but of course COVID-19 has kind of slowed things down a little bit. But what they actually aim to do is finalise the Close the Gap targets. One of the issues around the consultation was that there had been some talk that the Close the Gap targets, which we saw earlier, because they hadn't been achieved, would not be included in the new targets. Now, the attitude was that just because you couldn't achieve them doesn't mean that they weren't the right targets. It just might mean that the strategies that you were using to try and achieve these targets were wrong. And there was also a sense that the government was trying to actually abdicate its responsibility for its lack of achievement by not including the new targets. That is an attitude that some people held. The government would dispute that. They just said that they thought that if the targets weren't achievable, they shouldn't be included, but the targets are being negotiated. So the targets are going to focus on the number of priorities: families, children and youth, health, education, economic development, housing, justice, including youth justice, land and water, and cross-system priorities. Now you can see that this is a much more social determinants of health approach than what we saw with closing the gap. So under Nigel Scullion, who was the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, he had actually been resisted the idea of including justice and youth justice in the closing the gap targets. He thought that that was a state responsibility as per the Constitution, so therefore it didn't have a role in closing the gap. Now, I always found that particular argument to be a bit of a furphy, because education is actually a state responsibility from a Commonwealth level, so you can appreciate why I didn't necessarily believe that to be the case. What's also is really important is land and water. So when we think about our connection to country, that is essentially what that's doing. So all of these things are aimed at improving the health and well-being and life of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I have to say, this has been a significant shift, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this space. And it really does depend on making sure that there is going to be an ongoing partnership, both at a state and territory level, but also at the Commonwealth level. Now, I'm going to leave that there. I'm just going to sum up by saying, again, we know this is complicated. I have been working in this space for 15 years, and there are still things that I actually am discovering and finding out. So please don't feel like if you don't get all of these concepts straight from the away that you're a failure. Essentially, what you need to know is there's been a number of policies. The policies at some levels have been consistent over time, but also changed over time. But this is the first time we've seen a genuine partnership with the Closing the Gap refresh that we've ever seen at a Commonwealth and state level around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. There is a lot of expectation around this partnership, but there is also a lot of hopefulness around this partnership. And largely this has come from a huge amount of advocacy by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sector and our allies and accomplices. So thank you for listening to the last lecture, and I hope you have enjoyed.